Everyone thought he drowned during a case gone wrong. But 3 months later, he's back, barefoot, lost, and with no idea who he is. What happened during those missing months? And why did he come straight to her door? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in relentless sheets over Boston on that October evening in 1897, turning the cobblestone streets into rivers of darkness that reflected the gas lamps like scattered diamonds. Miss Eleanor Hartley stood at the window of her modest townhouse on Beacon Hill, watching the storm with an expression that mingled worry with something deeper, something that had haunted her for 3 long months. Her fingers traced the edge of the telegram she had received that afternoon, the paper already worn from her repeated readings, though the words never changed no matter how many times her gray eyes passed over them. Detective Jonathan Reed, presumed dead, body never recovered, case closed. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath forming a small circle of fog that obscured her view of the street below. Jonathan. The name still brought a sharp pain to her chest, a sensation she had grown accustomed to over the past season. She had known him for only 6 months before his disappearance, but in that brief time, he had become something more than just the detective investigating the theft at her late father's law firm. He had become her confidant, her intellectual equal, and perhaps, though she barely dared admit it even to herself, something her heart had begun to recognize as essential. The clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note echoing through the empty house. Eleanor's housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had retired early with a headache, leaving her mistress alone with her thoughts in the storm. At 26, Eleanor had inherited her father's analytical mind and his extensive library, but neither logic nor literature could ease the ache of loss that had settled over her life like a shroud. She remembered the last time she had seen Jonathan, standing in her father's study with his dark hair slightly disheveled, his tall frame bent over a ledger as he traced the pattern of missing funds with those long, capable fingers. He had looked up at her entrance, and his hazel eyes had brightened in a way that made her heart flutter despite her best efforts to remain professional. "Miss Hartley," he had said, his deep voice warm with genuine pleasure, "I believe I've found something significant." That had been the morning of July 15th. By nightfall he had vanished while pursuing a lead to the Boston Harbor warehouses. The police had found his coat and hat on the pier, and the detective's revolver lying near the edge of the water. The assumption had been drowning, though the Charles River had yielded no body. For weeks, Eleanor had clung to hope, visiting the police station daily, until even the most sympathetic officers had begun to avoid her desperate inquiries. A sharp knock at the front door startled her from her reverie. Eleanor glanced at the clock again, frowning. Who would call at such an hour, in such weather? She moved through the hallway, her dark green dress whispering against the floorboards, and reached for the door handle with some trepidation. The man on her doorstep was barely standing. He swayed slightly, one hand pressed against the door frame for support, the other hanging limply at his side. He was tall, powerfully built beneath clothing that hung on him in tatters, soaked through by the rain. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, plastered to his skull, and his face bore the shadow of a beard that spoke of weeks without proper grooming. But it was his feet that Eleanor's eyes fixed upon with shock and confusion. He wore no shoes, his bare feet bleeding slightly against the stone step. "Please," the man said, his voice hoarse and strained. "I need help. I don't know where else to go." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. The structure of his face, the height, the breadth of his shoulders, even the way he held himself despite obvious exhaustion, all of it was achingly familiar. But it couldn't be. It was impossible. "Jonathan?" she whispered, the name barely audible over the rain. The man's hazel eyes met hers, and in them she saw confusion, pain, and something that made her blood run cold, complete and utter blankness. He looked at her as one might look at a stranger, with no recognition, no spark of memory. "Is that my name?" he asked, and there was such desperate hope in his question that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "Are you someone who knows me? Because I don't know who I am. I don't remember anything before waking up in an alley 3 days ago. I've been walking, searching for something familiar, and when I saw this house, I felt drawn here. I thought perhaps it meant something." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that Jonathan Reed was dead, that this must be some cruel trick or remarkable coincidence. But her heart knew differently. Her heart recognized him in a way that transcended logic. "Come inside," she said, stepping back and pulling the door wider. "Quickly, before you collapse." He stumbled over the threshold and Eleanor caught his arm to steady him. Even through the wet fabric of his torn shirt, she could feel the solid strength of him, though he trembled with exhaustion and cold. She guided him to the sitting room, where the fire still burned low in the hearth, and helped him into her father's old leather chair. "Wait here," she instructed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll fetch blankets and something warm to drink." As she hurried to gather supplies, her mind raced through possibilities. If this truly was Jonathan, and some part of her already believed it was despite the impossibility, then where had he been for 3 months? What had happened to him to erase his memory so completely? And why had he appeared at her door barefoot and broken, drawn by instinct to a place his conscious mind no longer remembered? She returned with wool blankets, a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a pot of tea she had prepared earlier that evening. The man sat exactly as she had left him, staring into the fire with an expression of such profound lostness that Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Let me tend to your feet first," she said gently, kneeling before him with the basin. "They're bleeding." He allowed her to minister to him without protest, watching her face as she carefully cleaned the cuts and abrasions. His feet were calloused and rough, suggesting weeks of walking barefoot, and Eleanor's anger at whatever circumstances had brought him to this state burned hot in her chest. "You said you don't remember anything before 3 days ago," she asked as she worked, keeping her voice calm and encouraging. "Nothing clear," he replied, his deep voice roughened by exhaustion. "Just fragments, images that don't connect to anything, a feeling of urgency, like I was searching for something important, and fear. I remember being afraid, though I don't know of what." Eleanor wrapped his feet in clean bandages, then draped the blankets around his shoulders. She poured tea and pressed the warm cup into his hands, noting how they shook slightly as he accepted it. "My name is Eleanor Hartley," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "And if you are who I believe you are, then your name is Jonathan Reed. You were a detective with the Boston Police Department. 3 months ago, you disappeared while investigating a case, and you were presumed dead." He absorbed this information with a furrowed brow, his eyes searching her face as if looking for confirmation in her features. "A detective," he murmured. "That explains why I keep noticing things, small details. The way you hesitated before opening the door, checking through the side window first. The fact that this house is well maintained, but the furnishings suggest it belonged to someone older, a man perhaps, given the style of that desk in the corner. Your father's." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. "Yes, he passed away a year ago. You're still observant, even without your memory. That's very much like the Jonathan Reed I knew." "Knew?" he repeated, and something flickered in his eyes. "We were acquainted then? Before?" Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, uncertain how much to reveal. They had not been engaged, had shared no formal understanding, but there had been something between them, something unspoken, but deeply felt. How could she explain that to a man who looked at her with a stranger's eyes? "You were investigating a theft at my father's law firm when you disappeared," she said carefully. "We worked together on the case. You were very dedicated, very thorough. Everyone respected your abilities." He sipped his tea, his gaze never leaving her face. "And did I solve it? The case?" "No," Eleanor said softly. "You vanished before you could. The trail went cold after your disappearance. The case was closed unsolved." Something passed across his features then, a shadow of frustration or anger. His jaw tightened, and he set the teacup down with more force than necessary. "I hate this," he said abruptly. "This feeling of emptiness, where there should be memories. Looking at you, I feel like I should know you, like there's something important I'm forgetting. But it's all just blank." Eleanor's heart ached for him, for them both. "Memory can return," she said, though she had no medical knowledge to support this hope. "Perhaps with time and familiar surroundings, things will come back to you." He studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under the intensity of his gaze. Even diminished and confused, there was something compelling about him, a strength that drew her despite the circumstances. "Why did I come here?" he asked suddenly. "To this house? To you?" If I don't remember anything, how did I find my way to this door? It was a question Eleanor had been asking herself since she first saw him on her doorstep. I don't know, she admitted. Perhaps some part of you remembered this was a safe place. Perhaps instinct brought you where your conscious mind couldn't. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the city, but here in the warm circle of firelight, Eleanor felt the weight of Jonathan's presence like a physical thing. He was alive. Against all odds and reason, he was alive and sitting in her father's chair, looking at her with eyes that held questions she couldn't begin to answer. You should rest, she said, rising from her chair. I'll prepare the guest room for you. In the morning, we'll contact the police and begin trying to piece together what happened to you. He stood as well, though he swayed slightly with the effort. Miss Hartley, he said, and the formality of the address struck her as both appropriate and heartbreaking. Thank you for not turning me away, for believing me. I realize how extraordinary my story must sound. Eleanor met his eyes and saw in them a vulnerability that made her want to reach out and comfort him. Instead, she clasped her hands together and managed a small smile. You came to me for help, and I will help you. That's all that matters now. As she led him upstairs to the guest room, her mind was already working through the puzzle before her. If Jonathan was alive, then what had happened that night at the harbor? Who or what had caused his disappearance? And most importantly, who might still pose a threat to him now that he had returned? She settled him into the guest room, providing clean nightclothes that had belonged to her father, and promising to check on him in a few hours. As she closed the door and leaned against it in the hallway, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to feel the full weight of the evening's revelation. Jonathan Reed was alive. The man she had mourned, the man whose absence had left a void in her life she hadn't fully acknowledged until now, was sleeping just beyond this door. But he was also a stranger, stripped of the memories that had made him who he was, vulnerable in ways the confident detective she had known would never have been. Eleanor returned to her own room but knew sleep would be impossible. She sat at her writing desk and pulled out the notes she had kept from Jonathan's investigation, all the details she had preserved in the desperate hope that somehow, someday, she might finish what he had started. The theft at Hartley & Associates had involved $50,000, an enormous sum that had disappeared from the firm's accounts over the course of 6 months. Her father had discovered the discrepancy shortly before his death, and Eleanor had hired Jonathan to investigate discreetly. He had been close to identifying the thief when he vanished. She spread the papers before her, studying them with fresh eyes. If Jonathan's disappearance was connected to the case, and she strongly suspected it was, then whoever was responsible knew he was getting close to the truth. They had acted to stop him, perhaps attempted to kill him, and had very nearly succeeded. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor's bedroom, painting delicate patterns across the walls. She had managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep, her mind too active with questions and theories to allow proper rest. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the city washed clean and glistening under a pale October sun. Eleanor dressed carefully in a modest day dress of deep burgundy, pinning her dark hair into a practical arrangement that would allow her to work without distraction. She checked her appearance in the mirror, noting the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw. Today would require all her strength and composure. She had decisions to make, and they would affect not only Jonathan's future, but potentially his very life. She found him already awake when she knocked softly on the guest room door. He had managed to wash and dress in her father's clothes, which fit him reasonably well despite being slightly short in the sleeves. He looked more like the man she remembered now, though the beard and longer hair still gave him an unfamiliar appearance. He stood at the window, staring out at the street below, with an expression of intense concentration. "Good morning," Eleanor said gently, not wanting to startle him. "How are you feeling?" He turned to face her, and she was struck again by the stranger behind those familiar eyes. "Better, thank you. The rest helped, though I spent most of the night trying to remember something, anything concrete. It's frustrating beyond words." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe we need to be very careful about how we proceed. May I speak frankly with you?" "Please," he said, gesturing for her to continue. "I'm entirely at your mercy, Miss Hartley. You know far more about my life than I do." She moved to stand near the window, though she kept a respectable distance between them. "I believe your disappearance was not accidental. The case you were investigating involved a substantial theft, and you were close to identifying the culprit. I think someone tried to silence you, and very nearly succeeded. If we announce your return to the police immediately, word will spread quickly through the city. Whoever attempted to harm you before may try again." Jonathan's jaw tightened, and she saw something flash in his eyes that reminded her powerfully of the determined detective she had known. "You're suggesting we keep my return secret for now?" "I'm suggesting we use your amnesia as an advantage," Eleanor said, warming to her theory. "Right now, you're presumed dead. The person responsible believes they've succeeded. If we can investigate quietly, without alerting them to your survival, we might be able to uncover the truth before they have a chance to act against you again." He studied her thoughtfully, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath, waiting for his response. After a long moment, he spoke. "That's a dangerous proposition, Miss Hartley. If you're correct about the threat, then involving yourself further could put you at risk as well. I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm offering. This case was important to my father, important enough that discovering the theft may have contributed to the heart attack that killed him. I want to see it resolved, and I want to understand what happened to you. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "you're in no condition to investigate alone. You don't even remember how to be a detective." "But apparently I still am one," he said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. "My mind keeps cataloging details whether I wish it to or not. For instance, I noticed that the lock on your front door has been recently replaced. The wood around it is newer than the rest of the frame. And there's a systematic pattern to how you've arranged the books in the library downstairs by both subject and author, suggesting someone with legal training. Your father was an attorney, you said?" Eleanor felt a surge of hope at this evidence of his detective's mind still working. "Yes, and you're correct about the lock. I had it changed after a break-in attempt several months ago. Nothing was taken, but it left me uneasy." His expression sharpened immediately. "When did this happen? Before or after my disappearance?" 2 weeks after," Eleanor said, realizing the significance even as she spoke. "The police dismissed it as a random attempted burglary, but the intruder only tried my father's study. They didn't attempt any other rooms." Jonathan moved closer to her, his intensity almost overwhelming in the small space. "They were looking for something. The investigation files, perhaps, or evidence connected to the case. Miss Hartley, this confirms your theory. Someone is still concerned about what your father discovered and what I might have learned." Eleanor's heart raced, though whether from the revelation or his proximity, she couldn't be certain. "Then we need to be extremely careful. I still have all of my father's records and your investigation notes. I've kept them hidden, but if someone searches thoroughly enough, they'll find them." "Where are they now?" he asked urgently. "In a locked trunk in the attic, beneath several boxes of my mother's old clothing. It's not a sophisticated hiding place, but it's served so far." Jonathan nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "We'll need to review everything together. Perhaps seeing the evidence will trigger some memory, or at least give us a starting point for our investigation. But first, I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Tell me everything you know about the theft and the suspects." They moved downstairs to the study, where Eleanor prepared a light breakfast, while Jonathan examined the room with the careful attention she remembered so well. She found herself watching him as he worked, noting the way his long fingers traced the edge of her father's desk, how his tall frame moved with unconscious grace despite his ordeal. There was something deeply affecting about seeing him like this, vulnerable yet determined, stripped of memory but not of character. Over tea and toast, Eleanor recounted everything she knew. The theft had been discovered in March of 1897, when her father noticed discrepancies in the firm's trust accounts. Someone had been siphoning money gradually over 6 months, covering their tracks with false entries and forged signatures. Her father had 4 junior partners and a staff of 12 clerks and assistants. Any of them could have had the access necessary to commit the crime. The firm specialized in estate planning and property law, Eleanor explained, spreading documents across the desk. Many of our clients were wealthy families with complicated trusts. The thief chose accounts carefully, taking small amounts from several sources rather than large sums from one, making the theft harder to detect. Jonathan studied the papers with fierce concentration, his brow furrowed. "These forgeries are quite good," he murmured. "Whoever did this had access to genuine signatures to practice from, and considerable skill. Not many people could replicate your father's hand so precisely." That's what you said when you first examined the evidence, Eleanor said softly, then caught herself. Would reminding him of things he couldn't remember be helpful or frustrating? But Jonathan looked up at her with interest rather than distress. Did I? What else did I say? Please don't hesitate to tell me things. Even if I can't remember, knowing what I thought before might be valuable. Encouraged, Eleanor continued. You were particularly interested in 3 people. Thomas Blackwell, the senior junior partner who managed most of the trust accounts. Samuel Porter, the head clerk, who had access to all the firm's records and signatures. And Richard Thornton, one of the newer partners, who had recently experienced financial difficulties. Financial difficulties? Jonathan's attention sharpened. What kind? Gambling debts, according to rumor. He frequented the clubs on Hanover Street, places where gentlemen could lose significant sums at cards. My father had confronted him about it shortly before discovering the theft, warning him that such behavior reflected poorly on the firm. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his hazel eyes distant as he processed this information. So we have opportunity in all 3 cases, but motive is strongest with Thornton. What was I planning to do the night I disappeared? You said I was pursuing a lead to the harbor warehouses? Eleanor's throat tightened at the memory of that last conversation. You had discovered that someone in the firm had been receiving deliveries at a private warehouse near Long Wharf. You believed it might be connected to the theft, perhaps goods purchased with the stolen money. You were going to investigate that evening, but you never returned. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Jonathan's jaw clenched, and Eleanor saw his hands tighten into fists on the desktop. I walked into a trap, he said quietly. Someone knew I was coming and was waiting for me. That's what I've believed for 3 months, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Jonathan, if they tried to kill you and failed, where have you been all this time? What happened to your memory? And why did you return now in such a state? He looked down at his bandaged feet, still shoeless, and Eleanor saw confusion and frustration war across his features. I don't know. The earliest memory I can grasp is waking in an alley near the North End 3 days ago. I was wearing these same torn clothes, and I had no shoes, no identification, no money, just a terrible headache and a sense that something was desperately wrong. I've been wandering since then, trying to find something familiar. Last night, in the rain, I found myself on Beacon Hill, and when I saw this house, I knew it was important. I didn't know why, but I knew. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but blinked them back. This was no time for emotion. Jonathan needed her to be strong and clear-headed. We'll find the answers, she promised. Together, we'll piece together what happened to you and finish what you started. But we need to be strategic. We can't let anyone know you've returned until we understand the full situation. Agreed, Jonathan said. But Miss Hartley, I must insist on one condition. If at any point this becomes too dangerous, if there's a threat to your safety, you must step back and let me handle it alone. I won't have your well-being on my conscience, memories or not. The concern in his voice, the protective instinct, sent warmth flooding through Eleanor's chest. Even without memory, some essential part of Jonathan Reed remained intact, the part that had first drawn her to him those months ago. I'll be careful, she promised, though she had no intention of abandoning the investigation regardless of the risk. They spent the remainder of the morning reviewing the case files Eleanor had preserved. Jonathan proved to have an extraordinary capacity for absorbing and analyzing information, asking pointed questions and drawing connections that impressed her with their insight. Whatever had happened to his memory, his detective's intellect remained sharp and powerful. As noon approached, Eleanor prepared a simple lunch while Jonathan continued to study the documents. She found herself stealing glances at him as she worked, this familiar stranger who had returned so unexpectedly to her life. The sight of him sitting in her father's study, bent over papers with that intense concentration she remembered, felt both wonderfully right and painfully wrong. Eleanor, he called from the study, using her given name for the first time. She hurried to the doorway and found him holding up a piece of paper, excitement evident in his expression. I think I've found something. Look at this warehouse receipt. It's dated July 14th, the day before I disappeared. Eleanor crossed to the desk and examined the paper he indicated. It was a delivery receipt for the warehouse on Long Wharf, signed by someone with initials that looked like R.T. Richard Thornton, she breathed. This is what you must have discovered that made you go to the warehouse that night. And if Thornton realized I knew about his connection to this place, He would have had every reason to ensure I never shared that information, Jonathan said grimly. His hand unconsciously went to the back of his head, where Eleanor noticed for the first time a faint scar partially hidden by his hair. I wonder if this is how I lost my memory. A blow to the head, perhaps, meant to kill me, but only succeeding in erasing my past. Eleanor's stomach turned at the thought of Jonathan lying unconscious somewhere, hurt and alone, his memory bleeding away. But where were you all this time? 3 months is a long period to be missing. Someone must have seen you, helped you. That's what we need to discover, Jonathan said, standing and beginning to pace the length of the study. Eleanor watched his tall frame move restlessly, energy and determination evident in every line of his body despite his weakened condition. I need to retrace my steps from the alley where I awoke. Perhaps someone there can tell us something useful. We'll go together, Eleanor said firmly, anticipating his protest. You said yourself that you're in no condition to investigate alone, and 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Besides, I can ask questions in places where a barefoot man in borrowed clothes might attract unwanted attention. A smile tugged at the corner of Jonathan's mouth, the first real smile she had seen from him since his return. You're quite formidable, Miss Hartley. I can see why I chose to work with you before. Very well, we'll go together, but we need to address the matter of my appearance first. I can hardly walk the streets barefoot, and these clothes, while serviceable, mark me clearly as wearing another man's attire. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. I believe I can help with that. My father was a similar size to you, though not quite as tall. His shoes may fit well enough, and I kept several of his suits. We can also visit his barber this afternoon. A proper shave and haircut will make you less memorable, less likely to be recognized if anyone happens to see you. You've thought this through carefully, Jonathan observed, his hazel eyes studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. I'm beginning to understand why I felt drawn back here. You're not just offering shelter, you're offering partnership. We're both invested in finding the truth, Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her heart raced under his gaze. And we both deserve answers. Now let me find those shoes, and then we'll plan our afternoon carefully. As she climbed the stairs to retrieve her father's belongings, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to acknowledge the dangerous territory she was entering. She was about to conduct an investigation alongside a man who had been presumed dead, keeping his survival secret from the authorities, and putting herself directly in the path of someone who had already attempted murder once. It was reckless, possibly foolish, and certainly improper for an unmarried woman. But as she gathered the shoes and a fresh suit, she knew she wouldn't turn back. Jonathan needed her. The truth needed to be discovered, and somewhere deep in her heart, she needed this too. Needed to prove that the connection she had felt with him before his disappearance had been real and meaningful, not just her imagination. When she returned downstairs, she found Jonathan standing at the window once more, his silhouette strong and solid against the afternoon light. He turned as she entered, and something passed between them in that moment. A recognition that went deeper than memory, a connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Thank you, he said simply, taking the clothes from her. For everything. For believing me, for helping me, for not questioning the impossibility of my return. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but I'm grateful beyond words that you're willing to take this risk. Eleanor met his eyes steadily, seeing past the confusion and frustration to something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken. You're not asking, I'm choosing. And I would make the same choice again, Jonathan. Whatever happened to you, whatever we discover, I'm committed to seeing this through to the end. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the narrow streets of Boston's North End as Eleanor and Jonathan made their way through the crowded neighborhood. Jonathan looked remarkably different after his visit to the barber, his face clean-shaven and his dark hair trimmed to a respectable length. Dressed in her father's best suit and a pair of shoes that fit reasonably well with extra stockings, he could pass for any gentleman conducting business in the city. Only Eleanor knew the truth of who walked beside her, and the knowledge thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. They had taken a hired carriage from Beacon Hill, Eleanor giving the driver an address several blocks from their actual destination to avoid leaving a clear trail. Now they walked together through streets that grew progressively narrower and more crowded, the elegant townhouses of her neighborhood giving way to tenement buildings and small shops that catered to the immigrant families who called this area home. It was somewhere near here, Jonathan said, his eyes scanning the buildings with intense focus. I remember brick walls, very close together, and the smell of bread baking. There was a sign I couldn't read, letters in a language I didn't recognize. Eleanor followed his gaze, trying to see the neighborhood through his eyes. The North End was home to many Italian families, and signs in that language decorated numerous storefronts. Can you remember anything else? Any other details that might help us narrow down the location? Jonathan's brow furrowed in concentration as they continued walking. There were barrels stacked near the entrance to the alley. Empty wine barrels, I think, with faded labels. And I could hear church bells very clearly, closer than the ones from Old North Church. St. Stephen's, Eleanor said with growing certainty. There's a Catholic church just 2 streets over. If you could hear the bells clearly, you must have been nearby. She adjusted the simple shawl she wore, having dressed in her most modest attire to avoid drawing attention in this working-class neighborhood. This way. They turned down a side street, and Eleanor noticed how Jonathan's posture changed subtly, his body tensing as if recognizing something his mind couldn't consciously recall. His hand moved instinctively to her elbow, guiding her around a puddle left by the previous night's rain, and the casual protectiveness of the gesture made her heart skip. There, Jonathan said suddenly, stopping before a narrow passage between 2 brick buildings. That's where I woke. I'm certain of it. The alley was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, shadowed and dingy even in the afternoon light. Eleanor could see the wine barrels Jonathan had mentioned stacked haphazardly near the entrance, and the smell of fresh bread did indeed drift from a bakery whose back door opened onto the passage. She felt Jonathan tense beside her as they stood at the alley's mouth, and she gently touched his arm. Do you remember anything else? Anything about how you came to be here? He shook his head slowly, frustration evident in the tight set of his jaw. Nothing. It's as if my life began in that moment when I opened my eyes and saw brick walls above me. Everything before is just darkness. He turned to look at the buildings surrounding them, his detective's mind clearly working despite his missing memories. But someone must have brought me here. I couldn't have walked 3 months barefoot without anyone noticing, which means I was somewhere else during that time. Eleanor considered this carefully. Perhaps we should ask the residents if they saw anything unusual 3 days ago. Someone carrying an unconscious man, or a person who appeared confused and disoriented. Worth trying, Jonathan agreed, though his expression was doubtful. Though in a neighborhood like this, people often prefer not to notice things that might bring them trouble. They began with the bakery, where a stout Italian woman listened to Eleanor's carefully worded questions with suspicious eyes. No, she had seen nothing unusual. No, she didn't make a habit of watching the alley behind her shop. And no, she couldn't help them further. The door closed firmly in their faces, and Eleanor sighed. She was frightened, Jonathan observed. Not of us specifically, but of involvement in anything that might draw official attention. Many immigrants fear the police, even when they've done nothing wrong. Eleanor glanced at him with interest. How do you know that? He looked surprised by his own words. I don't know. It just seemed obvious from her reaction. A hint of excitement entered his voice. Perhaps other things will come back to me like that. Knowledge I don't remember learning but still somehow possess. They tried several more establishments along the street, receiving similar responses. No one had seen anything, or if they had, they weren't willing to discuss it with strangers asking questions. Eleanor was beginning to lose hope when they encountered an elderly man sitting on a stoop, smoking a pipe and watching the street with keen, bright eyes. "Excuse me, sir," Eleanor said, approaching with her most pleasant smile. "My friend and I are looking for information about something that happened in that alley 3 days ago. Did you perhaps see anything unusual?" The old man studied them both carefully, taking in Jonathan's fine clothes and Eleanor's respectable appearance. After a long moment, he removed his pipe and spoke in heavily accented English. "I see many things from this stoop. I sit here most days when weather permits. 3 days ago, very early morning before the sun, I see a wagon stop at the alley. 2 men. They carry something heavy, wrapped in canvas. They leave it in the alley and drive away quickly." Eleanor's heart leaped. "Could you describe the men? Or the wagon?" The old man shrugged. "Too dark to see faces clearly. But the wagon, it was a delivery wagon, the kind merchants use. Dark-colored, maybe black or dark blue. And one of the men, he walked with a limp. I remember because he had trouble with the weight of what they carried." Jonathan leaned forward, his intensity palpable. "Did you see which direction they came from or where they went?" "They came from the direction of the harbor," the old man said, pointing with his pipe. and when they left, they went toward Hanover Street. That's all I know. I thought maybe they were dumping something illegal, so I stayed inside after that. Didn't want trouble. Eleanor pulled a coin from her reticule and pressed it into the man's weathered hand. Thank you, sir. You've been very helpful. As they walked away, Eleanor felt Jonathan's excitement matching her own. A wagon from the harbor, she said quietly. That could connect to the warehouse where you were investigating. Someone must have kept you there all this time, then dumped you here when something changed. But why dump me here alive? Jonathan asked, his voice troubled. If they wanted to kill me, they had 3 months to do it. Why let me go now? Especially when losing my memory means I can't identify them or testify against them. It was a disturbing question, one that Eleanor had no answer for. They continued walking, both lost in thought, when Jonathan suddenly stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. His face had gone pale and his hand gripped Eleanor's arm with unconscious strength. Jonathan, what is it? Eleanor asked with concern. I just remembered something, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not a complete memory, just a fragment, but it's the first thing I've recalled since waking in that alley. He looked at her with haunted eyes. I remember darkness, complete darkness, and the sound of water. Not rain, but waves against wood. And I remember being cold, so cold I thought I would die from it. I was somewhere near water, somewhere confined. The warehouse, Eleanor breathed. They must have kept you prisoner there. But Jonathan, that means someone has been holding you captive for 3 months. Someone fed you, kept you alive, but also kept you hidden. Who would do that, and why? Before Jonathan could answer, a familiar voice called out from behind them. Miss Hartley, is that you? Eleanor turned to find herself face to face with Samuel Porter, the head clerk from her father's firm. Her blood ran cold as she realized the impossible situation they were now in. Porter's sharp eyes moved from Eleanor to Jonathan, and she saw recognition beginning to dawn in his expression despite the changes in Jonathan's appearance. Mr. Porter, Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice steady. What a surprise to see you here. Porter continued to stare at Jonathan, his weathered face creasing with confusion and something else, something that looked almost like fear. Detective Reed, he said uncertainly, but that's impossible. You're dead. We all thought you were dead. Jonathan met the older man's eyes calmly, and Eleanor marveled at his composure. Clearly reports of my death were premature, Mr. Porter, though I'm curious why you seem so disturbed by my survival. Most people would be pleased to discover someone they knew hadn't drowned after all. Porter's face flushed, and he took a step backward. I'm not disturbed, merely shocked. It's been 3 months, Detective. Where have you been all this time? What happened to you? That's what we're trying to discover, Eleanor interjected, her mind racing through possible explanations for Porter's presence in this neighborhood. Mr. Porter, what brings you to the North End today? This seems rather far from your usual territory. The clerk's eyes darted between them, and Eleanor could see him calculating, trying to determine how much they knew. I'm visiting a client, he said finally. Estate matters for an Italian gentleman who prefers to meet away from the office. Perfectly legitimate business, I assure you. I'm sure it is, Jonathan said smoothly, but Eleanor could hear the edge beneath his polite tone. Though it's interesting that you happen to be in this particular neighborhood on this particular day. Quite a coincidence. Porter's expression hardened. Are you suggesting something, Detective? Because I don't appreciate the implication that there's anything suspicious about my presence here. I've done nothing wrong. No one said you had, Eleanor said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension she could feel building between the two men. We're simply surprised to see a familiar face in such an unexpected place. I'm sure you understand. But Porter was already backing away, his face a mixture of anger and something else Eleanor couldn't quite identify. I need to get to my appointment. Miss Hartley, Detective Reed, if you'll excuse me. He turned and hurried down the street, glancing back once with an expression that made Eleanor's skin prickle with unease. Once he was out of sight, Jonathan turned to Eleanor with urgency in his voice. We need to follow him. I don't believe that story about meeting a client for a moment. He was too nervous, too defensive. And did you see his reaction when he first recognized me? That wasn't just surprise. That was fear. Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding. He walks with a slight limp, she said quietly. I never noticed it before, but when he turned away just now, I saw it clearly. Jonathan, he could be one of the men the old man saw dumping you in the alley. The implications of this hit them both simultaneously, If Porter was involved in Jonathan's disappearance, then he was also likely involved in the theft from the firm. But more importantly, he now knew that Jonathan was alive, which meant their advantage of secrecy was gone. They followed Porter at a careful distance, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to keep him in sight. He moved quickly through the narrow streets, his limp more pronounced now that they were watching for it. Eleanor's mind raced with questions and fears. Had Porter recognized Jonathan immediately, or had it taken him a moment? Would he warn his accomplices? And most frightening of all, would he now attempt to silence them both permanently? Porter led them on a winding route through the north end, doubling back several times as if checking for pursuit. Jonathan's hand found Eleanor's elbow again, guiding her through the crowded streets with a sureness that suggested his physical memory was intact, even if his conscious recall was not. She found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the solid strength of him, the way his body moved between her and potential danger without conscious thought. Finally, Porter stopped before a large warehouse near the waterfront, the same area where Jonathan had disappeared 3 months ago. Eleanor felt Jonathan tense beside her as they watched from the shelter of a nearby building. Porter glanced around nervously before producing a key and unlocking a side door to the warehouse. "That's it," Jonathan breathed, his voice tight with recognition he couldn't fully access. "That building. Something about it feels familiar. Important. Eleanor, I think that's where they kept me." Before Eleanor could respond, the warehouse door opened again, and another man emerged. Even from a distance, Eleanor recognized Richard Thornton, the junior partner with gambling debts. He and Porter stood close together, speaking in low, urgent tones. Even without hearing their words, the tension in their postures was evident. "Both of them," Eleanor whispered. "They're working together. The theft, your disappearance, all of it." Jonathan nodded grimly. "And now they know I'm alive. We need to get proof of their involvement before they have a chance to cover their tracks or disappear. Can you think of any way to access that warehouse without them knowing?" Eleanor's mind worked quickly through possibilities. "There's a shipping office 2 buildings down where my father did business occasionally. The manager there might be willing to tell us who leases that warehouse and what kind of deliveries they receive. It's not proof of wrongdoing, but it might give us leverage." "It's a start," Jonathan agreed. "But we need to move quickly. Once those 2 finish their conversation, they'll likely take action to protect themselves. We're running out of time." They hurried to the shipping office, where Eleanor used her father's name and reputation to gain an audience with the manager, a harried-looking man named Mr. Davies who clearly remembered John Hartley with respect. "The warehouse in question is leased to a company called Maritime Holdings," Davies told them after consulting his records. "They've been renting the space for about 8 months, paying in cash every month like clockwork. They receive deliveries of various goods, expensive items mostly, furniture, artwork, that sort of thing. All legitimate on the surface." "Do you know who runs Maritime Holdings?" Jonathan asked. Davies shook his head. "The lease was signed by an agent, not the owners directly. That's not unusual for business arrangements, but I remember thinking it was odd that they insisted on cash payments. Most companies prefer bank transfers for the records." 8 months, Eleanor thought. The theft had been ongoing for 6 months before her father discovered it, which meant Maritime Holdings had been established shortly before the stealing began. It was too perfect a coincidence. "Mr. Davies," Eleanor said carefully, "would you be willing to testify about these arrangements if it became necessary? If Maritime Holdings was involved in criminal activity?" The manager's expression grew wary. "That depends on what kind of criminal activity we're discussing, Miss Hartley. I run a legitimate business here, and I don't want trouble with the law or with dangerous men. We're talking about theft and possibly attempted murder," Jonathan said bluntly. "And the men involved are already aware that we're investigating them. If you help us now, we can ensure you're protected when this comes to light. But if you refuse, you may find yourself implicated as an accessory." Davies paled but nodded slowly. "I'll testify if needed. But you'd better be certain of your facts, Detective. These aren't the kind of men who take kindly to accusations." As they left the shipping office, Eleanor felt the weight of what they were undertaking settle more heavily on her shoulders. They were moving toward a confrontation with men who had already proven themselves willing to kill to protect their secrets. She glanced at Jonathan and found him watching her with concern in his hazel eyes. "You should go home," he said gently. "This has become too dangerous. I can take the information we've gathered to the police and let them handle it from here." "Absolutely not," Eleanor said firmly. "We're partners in this investigation, Jonathan. You said so yourself. I'm not abandoning you now. Not when we're so close to the truth." Something passed across his face then, an emotion she couldn't quite name, but that made her breath catch. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name again. "I can't remember our previous acquaintance, but I know this. I would never forgive myself if something happened to you because of me. You've already risked so much by sheltering me, by helping me investigate. Please, let me finish this alone." Eleanor stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I'm not doing this just because of you, Jonathan. I'm doing it for my father, for the truth, and yes, for you as well. But my choice, my risk to take. Don't ask me to step aside now." The tension between them hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Jonathan held Eleanor's gaze for a long moment, and she saw the conflict playing across his features, the desire to protect her warring with respect for her determination. Finally, he nodded, though reluctance was evident in every line of his body. "Then we do this together," he said quietly, "but carefully, and with a plan. We can't simply confront them without evidence that will hold up in court. We need proof of the theft, proof of my imprisonment, and proof that they were responsible for my disappearance." Eleanor felt relief flood through her at his acceptance, though she understood the gravity of what lay ahead. "The warehouse," she said thoughtfully. "If that's where they kept you, there might be evidence inside. Something that proves you were held there against your will." "It's risky," Jonathan said, his detective's mind clearly working through possibilities. "They'll be watching the place now that they know I'm alive. But if we wait until after dark, when the area is less busy, we might be able to get inside undetected." The plan was dangerous, possibly foolish, but Eleanor could see no other way forward. They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing, returning to her townhouse to gather supplies and wait for nightfall. Mrs. Patterson had returned from visiting her sister and was shocked to find a strange gentleman in residence, but Eleanor managed to explain Jonathan's presence as an old friend of her father's passing through Boston, and the housekeeper seemed satisfied with this explanation, if somewhat puzzled by the need for secrecy. As evening approached, Eleanor changed into her darkest dress and most practical boots, pinning her hair securely and covering it with a simple bonnet. Jonathan watched her preparations with a mixture of admiration and concern that made her heart flutter, despite their dire circumstances. "You're quite remarkable, you know," he said as she checked that she had a small lantern and matches in her bag. "Most women of your station would have fainted at the sight of a strange man on their doorstep, let alone agreed to conduct a criminal investigation with him." Eleanor met his eyes and saw genuine respect there, along with something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Most men of your station would have dismissed my help and insisted on handling everything themselves," she replied. "Yet you've treated me as an equal partner in this investigation. I think that says as much about your character as anything else." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his features in a way that stole Eleanor's breath. "I get the feeling that I knew you well before my memory loss, Miss Hartley, and I suspect that you were just as formidable then as you are now." The use of her formal address, despite the intimacy of their situation, reminded Eleanor of the strange position they occupied, neither strangers nor exactly friends, connected by circumstances that defied normal social conventions. She found herself wondering what their relationship had been before his disappearance, what unspoken understanding might have existed between them. "You should call me Eleanor," she said impulsively. "Under the circumstances, formality seems rather unnecessary." Jonathan's expression softened. "Eleanor, then, and you should call me Jonathan, not just when the moment requires it, but always. I may not remember our past, but I know that we've moved beyond the need for such barriers." The moment stretched between them, charged with emotion neither could fully express. Then the clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, breaking the spell and reminding them of the task ahead. They hired a carriage to take them back to the waterfront district, asking the driver to leave them several blocks from their actual destination. The October evening was cool and clear, the sky ablaze with the last colors of sunset as they walked through streets that grew progressively darker and more deserted. Eleanor felt Jonathan's presence beside her like a shield, his tall frame moving with confidence despite the danger they were walking into. The warehouse loomed before them in the gathering darkness, its bulk blocking out the stars. Most of the buildings in this area were closed for the night, the workers having returned to their homes, leaving the waterfront quiet except for the sound of waves lapping against the piers and the distant cry of gulls settling for the evening. "There's a window on the side," Jonathan whispered, pointing to a small opening about 8 feet above the ground. "If we can reach it, we might be able to get inside without using the main door." They found a stack of crates nearby and carefully positioned them beneath the window. Jonathan climbed up first, testing the window and finding it unlocked. He pried it open with careful movements, wincing slightly at the creak of hinges that hadn't been oiled in some time. Then he turned to help Eleanor up, his strong hands steady on her waist as she climbed. The interior of the warehouse was darker than the street outside, and Eleanor waited while her eyes adjusted. Gradually, shapes emerged from the darkness. Wooden crates stacked along the walls, furniture covered with dusty cloths, and in the far corner, something that made her blood run cold. A narrow cot with blankets, a bucket for water, and chains attached to the wall. Jonathan had seen it too. She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the tension radiating from his body as he stared at the makeshift prison cell. Slowly, as if drawn by a force he couldn't resist, he moved toward it. Eleanor followed, her heart breaking at what this represented. For 3 months, Jonathan had been kept here like an animal, chained and hidden away from the world. She watched as he knelt beside the cot, his hand reaching out to touch the chains with trembling fingers. "I remember," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Not everything, but pieces. The darkness, the cold, the sound of water against the warehouse walls. They kept me drugged most of the time, something that made me sleep, made me confused. But there were moments of clarity, moments when I knew something terrible had happened, when I tried to escape." He touched the back of his head where Eleanor had noticed the scar. "They hit me the first time I tried to get away. After that, they kept me more heavily drugged." Eleanor knelt beside him, her hand finding his shoulder. "Why didn't they just kill you, Jonathan? If they wanted you dead, why keep you alive all this time?" He looked at her, his hazel eyes haunted in the dim light. "Insurance, I think. As long as I was alive, they could use me as leverage if needed, or extract information about what I'd discovered. But once they realized I had amnesia from the head injury, I became useless to them. That's why they dumped me in the North End 3 days ago. They thought a man with no memory posed no threat." "But they were wrong," Eleanor said firmly. "Because even without your memories, you're still a detective. You still found your way back to the truth." A sound from outside the warehouse froze them both. Footsteps, multiple sets, approaching the main door. Eleanor's eyes met Jonathan's in the darkness, and she saw her own fear reflected there. They had been discovered. "The window," Jonathan breathed. But even as he said it, they heard voices from that direction as well. They were surrounded. The main door creaked open, and lamplight flooded the warehouse. Eleanor saw Richard Thornton enter first, followed by Samuel Porter and 2 other men she didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals who had the appearance of hired muscle. Thornton's face was twisted with anger and fear as his eyes found them near the makeshift cell. "I knew you'd come here," Thornton said, his voice shaking. "Porter said we should run, disappear before you could expose us. But I knew the detective would want to see where he'd been kept. Curiosity has always been your weakness, Reed." Jonathan stood slowly, pulling Eleanor behind him in a protective gesture. "It's over, Thornton. We have enough evidence to prove what you've done. The theft, my imprisonment, all of it. The shipping office has records of your warehouse lease under the false company name. Turn yourselves in now, and perhaps the court will show leniency." Thornton laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "Leniency? For theft and kidnapping? I'll hang, Reed, we both know it. At least I would hang if there were any witnesses left to testify." He gestured to the 2 hired men. "I'm afraid you and Miss Hartley have made a fatal error in judgment by coming here tonight." Eleanor felt Jonathan's body tense, preparing for violence. But before anyone could move, a new voice rang out from the darkness near the door. "Boston Police! Drop your weapons and put your hands where we can see them." Chaos erupted. The hired men reached for weapons, but police officers poured through the door, their revolvers drawn. Thornton tried to run but was tackled to the ground by a burly sergeant. Porter simply collapsed where he stood, his face gray with defeat. Through the confusion, Eleanor saw a familiar figure approaching them. Captain Michael Walsh of the Boston Police Department, a man her father had known well, came forward with relief evident on his weathered face. "Detective Reed," Walsh said, his voice thick with emotion. "When we received your message, I could hardly believe it. We thought you were dead, son. Eleanor felt confusion wash over her. Message? Captain Walsh, what message? We sent nothing to the police. Walsh looked equally confused. But we received a telegram this afternoon, signed by Detective Reed, saying he had survived and discovered evidence of the theft and his kidnapping at this warehouse. The telegram instructed us to come here at 8 o'clock precisely to make arrests. He pulled a telegram from his pocket and showed it to them. Jonathan studied it with a frown. I sent no telegram, Captain. Eleanor and I have been together all afternoon, and we told no one of our plans to come here tonight. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as understanding dawned. Someone else sent it, she said slowly. Someone who wanted the police here at exactly this time, when they knew we would be investigating the warehouse. But who? Jonathan asked. And why? The answer came from an unexpected source. Samuel Porter, now in handcuffs, looked up at them with tears streaming down his face. It was me, he said brokenly. I sent the telegram after I saw you in the North End this afternoon. I've been living with this guilt for 3 months, Detective. What we did to you, keeping you drugged and chained like an animal, it's haunted my every waking moment. When Thornton suggested killing you to prevent exposure, I went along with it because I was afraid. But after the blow to your head caused amnesia, I convinced him to let you live, to dump you somewhere you might be found and cared for. I thought perhaps God had given us a way out that didn't require more violence. Porter's voice broke completely. When I saw you today, alive and investigating despite your memory loss, I knew it was over. But I also knew that Thornton would try to kill you both rather than face justice. So I sent the telegram anonymously, timing it so the police would arrive while you were here before Thornton could act. It's the least I could do after everything I've done to hurt you both. Jonathan stared at the older man with a complex mixture of emotions playing across his face. You stole from the firm, helped kidnap and imprison me, and would have let Thornton kill me initially. But in the end, you saved our lives tonight. I don't know whether to thank you or curse you, Porter. Curse me, Porter said quietly. I deserve nothing less. I was weak, greedy, and cowardly. Mr. Hartley trusted me for 20 years, and I betrayed that trust for money. I can never atone for what I've done, but at least I can ensure you and Miss Hartley survive to see justice done. Captain Walsh cleared his throat. We'll sort all this out at the station. Detective Reed, Miss Hartley, I'll need detailed statements from you both. And Reed, we'll need to have a doctor examine you, given what you've been through. The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. They were taken to the police station, where Jonathan was examined by the department physician and declared remarkably healthy considering his ordeal, though the doctor recommended rest and good food to regain his strength. Eleanor gave her statement to Captain Walsh, carefully detailing everything that had happened from Jonathan's appearance on her doorstep to the confrontation at the warehouse. It was well past midnight when they finally returned to Eleanor's townhouse in a police carriage. Mrs. Patterson had long since gone to bed, leaving the house quiet and dark except for a lamp burning in the front window. Eleanor felt exhaustion pulling at her limbs, but also a strange reluctance to let this extraordinary day end. Jonathan walked her to the door of her bedroom, and they stood in the hallway, neither quite ready to part. So much had happened, so much had been revealed and resolved, yet Eleanor felt as if something important remained unspoken between them. Eleanor, Jonathan began, his voice soft in the darkness. I need to tell you something, and I'm not certain how to say it properly. These past 2 days with you, investigating together, trusting each other, have felt more real to me than anything I can actually remember. I don't know what our relationship was before my disappearance, but I know what I hope it might become now. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest as he continued. You've been brave and clever and loyal beyond anything I had the right to expect. You've saved my life in more ways than one. And somewhere in all of this, I've come to care for you deeply. I realize this is entirely improper, that I should wait until my memory returns, and we can rebuild on the foundation of what we had before. But I can't keep silent when I feel this strongly. He took her hand gently, his thumb tracing circles on her palm that sent shivers through her entire body. Eleanor Hartley, would you allow me to court you properly, to see if this connection we've forged through adversity might grow into something more? Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Jonathan, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, before you disappeared, we had begun to develop feelings for each other, though neither of us had spoken of it openly. You were investigating the case at the firm, but you also found excuses to call on me, to discuss books and ideas and everything beyond the investigation. I mourned you for 3 months, and when you appeared on my doorstep, it felt like a miracle I didn't dare believe in." She squeezed his hand, holding his gaze steadily. "So yes, Jonathan Reed, I would very much like for you to court me properly. We'll rebuild your memories together, discover who you were, while also discovering who you're becoming. And perhaps, if we're very fortunate, we'll build something even stronger than what we had before." The smile that transformed Jonathan's face was radiant, full of hope and happiness that made him look years younger despite his ordeal. "Then I'm the most fortunate man in Boston tonight," he said, "to have survived impossible circumstances and found my way back to you, to have solved the case that nearly killed me, and to have gained the promise of a future with someone as extraordinary as you." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and respectful that Eleanor felt her heart might burst from her chest. "I should let you rest," he said reluctantly. "You must be exhausted after everything we've been through today." "I am," Eleanor admitted. "But Jonathan, before you go, I want you to know something. Whether your memories return or not, whether you remember falling for me the first time or only remember this new beginning, it doesn't matter to me. The man you are now, the man who found his way back through darkness and confusion to stand beside me, that's the man I care for. That's the man I'm choosing." Jonathan's eyes shone with emotion in the lamplight. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything, but especially for that. Good night, Eleanor. Sleep well and know that tomorrow begins a new chapter for both of us." "Good night, Jonathan," she replied softly. She watched him walk down the hallway to the guest room, then entered her own chamber and leaned against the closed door, her heart full to bursting. So much had been resolved tonight, so many mysteries solved and dangers overcome. Thornton and his accomplices would face justice for their crimes. The money stolen from her father's firm would be recovered from the warehouse where they had hidden it among the expensive goods, and Jonathan, against all odds, had survived and found his way back to her. The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through Eleanor's bedroom window to wake her gently. She dressed with care in a gown of soft blue that she knew complemented her features, then made her way downstairs to find Jonathan already awake and sitting in the breakfast room with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. He looked up as she entered, and the warmth in his smile made her feel as if she were floating. "Good morning," he said, rising to pull out her chair. "I hope you slept well, Mrs. Patterson has prepared a wonderful breakfast, and Captain Walsh sent a messenger earlier to say that Thornton and Porter have both confessed fully. The case is officially closed." Eleanor settled into her chair, accepting the coffee he poured for her. "And your memory? Has anything else returned?" Jonathan's expression grew thoughtful. "Fragments. Nothing complete yet. But the doctor said that being in familiar places and around familiar people might help jog loose more memories over time. He's recommended I return to my own rooms, resume my normal routines as much as possible." Eleanor felt a pang at the thought of him leaving, though she knew it was necessary. "Of course," she said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "You'll want to reclaim your life, settle back into your work with the police department." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Eleanor, my rooms are only a 20-minute walk from here, and I intend to call on you daily, if you'll permit it. Captain Walsh has given me a month's leave to recover, which means I'll have ample time to properly court you as I promised last night." Relief and happiness flooded through Eleanor. "I would like that very much. Perhaps we could start by visiting some of your favorite places in Boston, places that might help trigger your memories. And I still have my father's library, which you spent considerable time in before. Maybe the books will help." "I have a better idea," Jonathan said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Why don't we start fresh, discovering the city together as if for the first time? We can visit places I might have been, certainly, but also new places, creating new memories alongside any old ones that might resurface. What do you say?" Eleanor smiled, understanding the wisdom in his suggestion. They were building something new together, something that honored the past but wasn't bound by it. "I think that sounds perfect," she said. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Eleanor's life. True to his word, Jonathan called on her every day, and they explored Boston together with the excitement of new lovers discovering each other. Some outings did trigger memories for Jonathan. fragments and images that gradually began to piece together the story of his life before the kidnapping. He remembered his parents, long deceased, and his decision to become a detective. He remembered cases he had solved and criminals he had brought to justice. But more importantly, he remembered moments with Eleanor, the first time he had seen her in her father's study, how her intelligence and grace had immediately captivated him. Conversations they had shared over tea, debates about literature and philosophy that had stretched for hours. The growing awareness that she had become essential to his happiness, though propriety had prevented him from declaring himself before the investigation was complete. "I was planning to speak to you after I solved the case," he told her one afternoon as they walked through the public garden, the autumn leaves creating a carpet of gold and crimson beneath their feet. "I wanted to be able to approach you without the complications of our professional relationship, to court you properly as you deserved. And then everything went wrong at the warehouse, and I thought I'd lost my chance forever." Eleanor squeezed his arm gently. "But you didn't lose your chance. You found your way back to me, and now we have the opportunity to build something wonderful together." 6 weeks after Jonathan's return, they stood together in the same spot where they had walked that autumn day. But now the winter snow was beginning to fall, dusting the trees and paths with white. Jonathan had regained most of his memories, though some gaps remained and likely always would. But it didn't matter anymore. He had built a new life that incorporated the best of his old one while creating space for new experiences and new joy. He turned to Eleanor, taking both her hands in his. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion she could see in his hazel eyes. "Eleanor Hartley, you saved my life in every way that matters. You gave me shelter when I was lost, partnership when I was confused, and love when I needed it most. You've helped me rebuild myself into someone stronger than I was before, someone better. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Eleanor felt tears of joy stream down her face as she nodded, unable to speak past the happiness that threatened to overwhelm her. Jonathan produced a ring from his pocket, a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond, and slipped it onto her finger. "Yes," she finally managed to say. "Yes, Jonathan, I will marry you. I will be your partner in all things, just as we've been partners through this extraordinary journey. I love you, not just for who you were, but for who you are and who we're becoming together." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as the snow fell around them, and Eleanor felt complete in a way she never had before. They had both been through darkness and emerged into light, had both been lost and found their way home. Whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, building a life based on trust, respect, and a love that had been tested by impossible circumstances and emerged stronger for it. As they walked hand in hand back toward Beacon Hill, Eleanor thought about everything that had happened since that rainy October evening when Jonathan had appeared on her doorstep barefoot and broken. It had been a journey filled with danger and mystery, with revelations and confrontations that could have ended in tragedy. But instead, it had led them here, to this moment of promise and new beginnings. "What are you thinking about?" Jonathan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Eleanor smiled up at him, her heart full. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the most impossible circumstances. And I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you found your way back to me, even when you didn't know who you were or where you belonged." Jonathan stopped walking and turned to face her, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I will always find my way back to you, Eleanor. Memory or no memory, that's one truth I know with absolute certainty. You are my home, my partner, my future, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your love and trust." "You already have," Eleanor whispered, standing on her toes to press a gentle kiss to his lips. Their first kiss, a seal on the promise they had made to each other. As they continued walking through the snowy streets of Boston, toward the townhouse where their story had begun, and toward the future they would build together, Eleanor knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, with courage, intelligence, and an unshakable faith in each other. Their love story had begun in mystery and darkness, but it would continue in light and joy, a testament to the power of trust, determination, and the kind of love that transcends even the loss of memory itself. The case was closed, the criminals brought to justice, and two hearts that had found each other against impossible odds were now bound together forever. It was, Eleanor thought, The most perfect ending and the most promising beginning all at once.